To our end of the semester. Today we're going to be talking about public policy making and touch a little bit on budget making. Um, let's get right to it. Exciting stuff. We're going to talk about there's 5 stages of domestic policy making. You'll be able to see these charts and more information about these 5 stages in your textbook. We'll talk a little bit about the history of U.S. social policy and we'll pay special attention to entitlement programs. Um, you can think about what constitutes good policy, whether it's feasible, whether it's fair, if it's economically efficient. And we'll discuss a little bit about the privatization of public services, but you can find more about that in your book. We'll talk about the federal budget process. There's a few things you'll need to know. And then at the end, we'll just discuss some reforms, but actually, these ideas of reforms are going to come from you in your last assignment on bureaucracy. So you'll look at what kind of reforms the government could possibly do to help things run smoother. So basically, we're talking about the work that starts in Congress, goes to the executive branch. If there's problems, it might be looked at by the judicial branch, but it's all about setting up services that affect or serve us or some of us or help um, create some kind of service. So the 4 steps involved are the first thing is agenda setting, deciding which policies need to be made and deciding on how to make them. So setting the agenda is usually done by, as we talked before, either Congress comes up with the ideas or we, the people, protest or complain or make our voice known of what we want them to do, or the media discusses it. Sometimes the media discusses it and then we get enraged about it. And so we go out and protest or we start writing our congressperson. And then the congresspeople put it on their agenda. Sometimes it's the other way around. So agenda setting is based on a couple different things. Then it goes to framing what the policy issue itself. Then the actual policy formation. We won't go into detail about that because that's how a bill is made. So you can refer to the Schoolhouse of Rock if you want to go into detail about that. Once the bill is made and signed into law by the president, it is implemented in the executive branch. So we're reviewing here from the last couple of chapters. And then this part we haven't talked about, it's evaluated or there's oversight where Congress will come in and look at, hey, how's that program going? Does it need more money? Is it working well? Do we need to make an amendment? Do we need to get rid of it? That's the evaluation and feedback, checking in and taking surveys. But we're going to start with agenda setting first. So this is the first step in making a policy, making some kind of service. Where the policy itself gets a whole lot of attention. So right now, big policies that are being talked about, being made are immigration policies, energy or climate change policies, um, and then policies possibly on gun regulations, either making them stricter or making them looser. And by the way, I'd just like to bring up gun regulation policies. There were several people that wrote in their in some of their discussion questions about some people want to take away guns. So let's just be clear that usually the debate about gun control is about how much gun control we should have. We already regulate guns as it is. So it's a matter of, are we going to regulate it more or do we need to loosen up? So oftentimes I try to look to see if there are actual groups that are that come and take away guns or that are threatening to come and take away guns. And the only bit of news I could find was the current president threatening that. But I didn't find other like liberal groups that are set to take away the Second Amendment. I haven't heard of anybody wanting to repeal or take away the Second Amendment, but definitely wanting to make more restrictions. So in policies regarding guns, just make sure we keep that clear, that it's not usually an argument between taking away a Second Amendment right or keeping the Second Amendment right, but it's more an issue of should we have stricter gun regulations or fewer or looser gun regulations. Okay, but when we're talking about, so a focusing event, your book talks about a focusing event. And if we're on the issue of guns, it could be a mass shooting. That could be a focusing event where people get up in arms, so to speak, no pun intended, but get very upset, and then Congress listens to them and wants to start some kind of policy. Another example in your book that they talk about is when Obama was in office, he had plans as part of his energy plan was to open and continue to expand America's nuclear program. But because of the earthquake in 2011, earthquake and consequent tsunami that knocked out the Fukushima power plant in Japan, Obama's plans the agenda completely changed. So it really depends on what the news covered it. People got kind of scared of nuclear power, and he just took that off the discussion table, period, because of what had happened in Fukushima regarding the nuclear power plant. Now, I wish we were in a face-to-face class to have more discussion about this, but I have spent some time in Japan, and especially 2 years ago, I went to Fukushima, to some areas. This is a picture from a car dealership 6 years after the earthquake. This was the damage done by the earthquake, but it was actually left exactly the same way because this was in a town that they evacuated because it was too close to the nuclear power plant. But in 2017, the government opened up a few more towns and said, "Hey, come on back and live here." And I went there to see the amount of trash that I had heard that they had been storing of nuclear radiated waste. And so this is some of the waste area. They took shrubs and any of the garbage that was radioactive, and they put them in these big, large garbage bags, then piled them like 4 stories high, and then covered them with these green tarps. And let's see if I can find another here. So this is a problem that Japan is dealing with right now, that we could also deal with. Japan had 55 nuclear power plants. They only have a couple of them active right now. But this is the results of one that had an accident on it. We have 105 in the United States, and this isn't even the problem about the spent fuel rods. This is just the trash that's that's radioactive, that they need to get rid of. Some of the areas that they've opened up still have dangerously high radiation levels. And the power plant is still right around the area of the power plant, which is up here, is still under evacuation, but they're trying to open up other areas that are closer. So your book talks about this Fukushima plant meltdown after the tsunami, that the U.S. approval ratings for nuclear power plants plummeted. So that changed. It was a focusing event that changed Obama's plans to open up more nuclear power in America. So sometimes focusing events happens outside of the country. This shows us a little bit about how our public opinion, and this is based on public opinion polls, what we think is important. So this was 2011. We thought that unemployment and jobs was the most important thing, but 3 years later, we were more dissatisfied with the government. And your book has a more accurate one. I've been logged out. Let's see if I can get back in real quick here. Sorry. Your book shows more of one from, I believe, the last couple years, um, as far as how our public opinion priorities change, what we think is important. So in 2016, the general economy was the most important on people's minds: dissatisfaction with the government, employment and jobs, and immigration. By 2018, it was immigration, dissatisfaction in the government, race relations, lack of respect for others, unifying the country. So, actually, a whole new group of problems. Oh, sorry, you can't see the numbers. So, this is what your book tells you here. So, how the public feels about certain issues dictates sometimes how government will act. So, then the second step is called the framing step. This is the second stage. It's how we define the problem, and how Congress or the media, sometimes ourselves, but mainly Congress, whatever the problem, however we're framing it to the public, it dictates how it's going to be looked at. So your book uses education, or is it that we're bad test takers? Is it that because we have overcrowded classrooms, unqualified teachers? Which level of government should be in charge of education? Should it be the federal government or local, or a mix of the two, which would be kind of like cooperative federalism, like the marble cake that we talked about? Sometimes this framing is, what is the root cause of the problem? How bad is the problem? And how should the public officials respond to it? So sometimes issues can be framed not necessarily straightforward, but in the issue of education, if we look at our scores, our test scores in math, reading, and science compared to other countries, and we see where we are landing in these basic skills, it can be very embarrassing for the United States, and if when this is publicized more, then people are more apt to spend more money or more support for education. But if you go, oftentimes people will blame it on the parents, or blame it on the teachers, or blame it on whatever. But however the policy is framed, that's the approach that you can take um, to deciding how to format the policy. So the third stage is formatting, and this is policy formation. Sorry, this is actually the process of legislation, and then the executive activities that actually implement. So when you're forming it, there's always a few things that happen. We have what we call, an analysis of the policy, which would be looking at it. How much is it going to cost us? What is it going to accomplish? So in order to do this, you have to do some accounting, some projection. You're just guessing. So this is ex ante, which means beforehand. We do a little bit of cost benefit analysis. So your book uses a gas tax as an example. So when I have my face-to-face class, I like to ask them, if the tax was raised so high that our gas was $8 or $10 a gallon, like it's been for many years in Japan and in Europe, what would you do? What choices would you make? And typically people will answer, oh, well, I'd just pay it. Or they'll say, I'd stop driving, or I'd get a better mileage, a car with better gas mileage, or maybe I'd start taking the bus or riding my bike to work, or maybe I would move closer to my work or my school so I could commute easier. Or maybe move to a city that has mass transit better than Las Vegas. So this topic of a gas tax, when it's often being debated in Congress, and the idea would be to have a cost benefit analysis. So you show the cost of the gas tax. So this is a direct cost to us as the drivers and a direct cost to anything that's dependent on transportation, like you order something on Amazon or you take an Uber or whatever. All these services would go up. And then but the benefits would be reduced air pollution. You'd have less people driving because they'd be making decisions based on the cost. You'd have reduced in CO2. You'd reduce the U.S. dependence on imported oil. You'd have less traffic congestion, possibly less traffic accidents. And in the less traffic congestion, you can also improve public health, just like here with the less cars that are just sitting around stalled. If you've ever driven on the LA freeway during rush hour, you know what that's like. And so we take these benefits, these costs and these benefits, and we put numbers on them. So your book put how much it would cost us per person. I think it's per gallon of gas, and then how much we would save per gallon of gas. And so the benefits usually, sometimes it's hard to get these numbers, but it is possible to get an estimate based on asthma records, based on how much it's costing us to combat climate change as it is. If we reduce the impacts, we could save some money. And how much time saved in traffic, so your production costs, and then reduced accidents. So that's part of policymaking, is having something that says, hey, this is what we expect to see if we put this policy in place. And then the next step we talked about a bit in bureaucracy. This is policy implementation. It would include the executive branch through the bureaucracies to make rules. And we talked about that whole process in one of the last lectures. And then also to actually deliver the service, which is implementation. And so your book talks about the Affordable Care Act, which was implemented through several different health agencies in the government. And so the one thing that I want to point out, your book talks about top-down delivery and bottom-up delivery. So this is how the service is delivered. So for example, we have meat inspectors, government meat inspectors, and they are with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So if there is some kind of, say, E. coli detected in meat or in vegetables, the top-down delivery would be that the cabinet secretary would make a big announcement nationwide and just say, pull all the spinach off your shelf, or pull all this kind of meat off your shelf. And that would be a top-down delivery of a safety service that is a common good for everyone. A bottom-up delivery service is when the street-level bureaucrats, and those are the people, we've talked about this before, these words are all in bold, so you'll need to know these. When a street-level bureaucrat actually delivers a service. So some of the examples would be a social worker or a IRS worker or air traffic controller. I'm sure most of you have flown on an airplane before. We depend on the air traffic controllers that work for the federal government to deliver us the service of delivering us safely to the landing strip and to our families, right? So that would be an example of bottom-up delivery. So bottom-up delivery is delivered by street-level bureaucrats. Top-down delivery is delivered by usually appointed secretaries or heads of the departments. And then the last stage is the policy evaluation and feedback. So this stage is basically, usually it could be Congress, or it could be the bureaucracy themselves, where they look back and they say, hey, how are we doing? How much money is this costing us? How much money are we actually saving? What's working? What isn't working? So they evaluate it, they assess it, and they make a judgment of whether the program is effective, and they make recommendations. So usually the bureaucracy themselves will do this. They'll self-evaluate, and also they can be evaluated by Congress or even an outside entity. So this is the Affordable Care Act. This was their balance sheet per year of how much they projected it would cost them and how much it would save them year by year. So this is a similar look to an evaluation or feedback. So those are the 5 steps. All right, so moving on. The next part, we're going to talk about what kinds of policies are we talking about. When we talk about U.S. social policies, we're talking about things that have to do with an individual or with a group well-being. And these issues are typically around health, housing, education, employment, criminal justice, child welfare, old age security, abortion, same-sex marriage, recreational drug use, gun control. We just discussed that, and welfare. And one more issue that came up in some of the discussion questions, several people commented on, I think it was either individualism, that the idea that we take care of ourselves and the government, compared to a social democracy where the government helps everybody. There were some comments about welfare, so I'd really love it if you all took a look at this article. It's a really great article that's online. I've given you the link there. It's the 6, it shows the 6 major welfare programs, and it also shows the biggest myths versus the facts. So it basically, I think there were some comments about how people just stay on welfare forever. That's not true. There are limitations in place of how long somebody can receive welfare, what they have to do in order to get certain benefits, and some of the history about it. So it's a very short, easy read. It's got a lot of links you can look at, but very interesting article. So I would highly recommend, if you're interested in really knowing the truth about how people, if they get food stamps, what they have to do to keep it, and how the programs really work. They have changed, and there are limitations, and it's not as easy as it sounds. And oftentimes we hear people talk. Okay, so here's one thing you need to be careful of. People say, or I heard, or someone said. So if you listen on the news and they're saying, well, I know that this person has been on welfare forever. Please check out this link and find out the facts about our welfare system. Okay. So social policy in the United States, it's typically controversial. And the reason for this, I want to bring us back to that very first discussion question about I think it was the first or the second, about the elevator analogy. So the idea of the elevator analogy was, how much are you willing to have your tax dollars go towards a service or a policy that either you use and you benefit from? Most likely you don't mind some of your money going towards that because you're getting a benefit. That maybe you use sometimes, that would be the elevator and you're on the 2nd floor, but sometimes you just take the stairs. Or if you're on the 1st floor and you don't need the elevator at all, and you say, I don't want to give any of my money, I don't want them to take any of my taxes to go towards helping clean water on the West Coast or something like that. So it's often controversial because we all have our opinions about where we think how much taxes should be taken from us and what should be done with those taxes. And guess what? That's the definition of politics. Who gets what, where, when, and how. And so part of that who gets comes from where they're getting those resources from, and that's us. So social policies often, this is where people don't want to talk about politics, because if you feel strongly about a certain issue and the person you're talking to feels strongly the other way, and hopefully it's based on factual information, but say that welfare myth where people think that people that are on welfare are on it forever, and they don't really know the information, but what they hear and they believe, then they're never going to support any kind of welfare programs, right? So this is the really sticky place of trying to find solutions that will help the greatest amount of people the most efficiently. Our biggest problems with our bureaucracies, as you do your bureaucracy assignment, you'll see, is that there's more waste than necessary, and we need to trim the fat of where we're in order to save money. And so we don't have to be taxed all the time, and so we don't have to have a great debt and deficit. But social policies have grown throughout the years, usually after wars or after economic downturns or any kind of major sources of expansion in American history. The biggest example, and this you'll definitely be asked a question on, so please read about it in your book if you already don't know about it from high school history. But Franklin D. Roosevelt was the president, longest holding. I think he was in it for 4 terms. He brought about what he called the New Deal policy expansion, which was all kinds of new policies after the Great Depression. So basically, the banks failed, the stock market crashed, the banks failed, everyone lost their savings, their homes, their jobs. And so, in order to get America back on their feet again, they had to solve a lot of problems. One of the issues was now they had a whole bunch of old people who lost all their savings, so they couldn't take care of themselves. They didn't have enough money to eat, and so they came up with this entitlement program called Social Security shortly after the Great Depression, where everyone would pay into it. It's an insurance program where you would pay into it as you worked when you were younger, and then when you were older, you could take out a monthly small stipend that would help you. So this program has grown to be kind of a, a sore spot and a difficult challenge for us, and we'll look a little bit more about that later. But this is one of the many programs that were built during the New Deal period. The three large social programs during that time are Social Security, which included unemployment insurance, and then Medicare and Medicaid. Those came along a little bit later, but shortly after that. So wars move social policy into being. We've seen after the Revolutionary War, we saw a lot of organized benefits administered to the state level. And then after the Civil War, there were lots of benefits to soldiers and their family. After World War II, we had a GI Bill created, a policy passed GI Bill where even to today, military people can get assistance in education and buying a new home and various things like that. All right, so this Social Security, this is one of the hardest problems to figure out what to do about. So we're going to try to talk about it as best we can without me having a chalkboard and drawing designs on the board. So it started in 1935. This is after the Great Depression. Social Security provided 65 years and older. At the time, it was 65. Now, the age is slowly rising. Provided them that lived in the United States or for at least 5 years with a monthly stipend, a living stipend. The minimum age has recently raised to 66, and I think when I retire, it'll be 67 and a half or 66 and a half, something like that. And Congress has discussed increasing this by another 2 in a year or two. Social Security payments vary depending on what kind of income you have brought in throughout your life. There's a calculation that the Social Security Department uses. It's financed through payroll tax. So for those of you who have a job, you know that when you get your paycheck, there's Social Security insurance money taken out. And then there's also, you pay some and your employer pays some. And then there's also unemployment benefits taken out in case you are qualified to receive unemployment benefits. And then healthcare and disability, we have Medicare, and this is a federal program that pays for healthcare expenses for people 65 and older. Enrolled individuals must pay deductibles and co-payments, but much of their medical costs are covered by this program, and it's also financed through. So that's another part of your paycheck that will be taken out to pay towards Medicare. when you're younger, and then you get it when you're older. Medicaid is the same thing, a health assistance program for people who of low income or handicapped people. So, or people with disabilities. The federal poverty line is decided by the government. I'm not sure what it is exactly, somewhere in the 20,000 a year. All of these programs are entitlement programs, and that means they're government benefit programs whose recipients are entitled by law to receive the payments. And they're also programs that we actually pay into. So it's not just a one-way street. We're paying into it, and then we can receive it if we qualify. Besides Medicaid, if you haven't paid into Medicaid, if you qualify, you still get it. So that's a little bit different. But Medicare, Social Security, and unemployment, we pay out of our taxes. So I'd like to go a little bit more into Social Security because this is an issue that will affect you all no matter what age you are. So let's take a look at this little information video here.
Republican-controlled House of Representatives was back in session. The Republican majority passed a rule restricting the transfer of money from the Social Security Retirement Fund into the So
sorry.
Social Security Disability Insurance Program. Some fear that this will lead to the Social Security Disability Trust Fund going bankrupt by 2016. This all may be a bit unfamiliar and confusing, so let's start by answering the question, what is Social Security and how will it affect you in the future? Social Security is a program first initiated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1935, and it was designed as a safety net to support retirees and the elderly. Before he started the Social Security program, care for those people who were too old to work was traditionally provided by the family members or poorhouses, which, in the wake of the Great Depression and other economic factors, was becoming a less viable option. After the law took effect, monthly paychecks were then sent to individuals aged 65 or older who were no longer working. At the time, only 1% of people's income went to Social Security. Since then, the percentage that is taxed has gone up. Now, with some restrictions, 6.2% of an employee's income and another 6.2% tax on employers goes towards Social Security. Also, the age at which benefits are received has changed. In 1961, the earliest age at which you could retire and begin receiving money was reduced to 62. However, now as a result of a 1983 amendment, waiting to retire until age 67 reaps the most benefits. Subsequent amendments over the years have also expanded the realm of care to disabled, dependent children, surviving spouses, and others. Problems with Social Security have arisen over the years mainly due to changes in the population. In 1935, there were 16 workers for every Social Security recipient in the United States, and now it is closer to a 3-to-1 ratio. In 1975, it was reported that taxes soon wouldn't cover Social Security payments, so the taxes went up and benefits were reduced. In 1983, a similar crisis occurred, and President Reagan formed the Greenspan Commission to study and suggest solutions to Social Security, but no real fix was found. So what does Social Security look like right now? Currently, the numbers from the government suggest that most people 65 or older receive Social Security, and that money represents about 38% of their income. On average, that's a pretty big number, but many accountants now urge people to view Social Security as supplemental rather than a primary income. However, reports also suggest that half of older married couples and 3/4 of unmarried older people rely on Social Security for a majority of their income. Experts say that at the current rate, the Social Security Trust Fund will be bankrupt by 2033. But to be clear, that doesn't mean millennials won't get any money from the government. They will still get some, they just won't get all of the benefits that previous generations experienced. They will get about 77% of original fund estimates, unless, of course, a major Social Security overhaul happens, which some people in politics, like Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, are already calling for. To find out more about...
Okay, so I like that video. If you don't understand what Social Security is or why you should even care about it, please rewatch that again. I know he goes over everything pretty fast, but the main thing is that there you have to pull out money from the people that are working. And then you have to, at the same time, you're paying paychecks to the people who are retired. But right now, we're experiencing the baby boomers are retiring, and this is the largest chunk of our population. So we have more people that will be pulling out of Social Security than we actually have workers putting in. And so, in order for there to be enough money, or any money, or enough money for when you all retire, uh, one of three things has to happen in order to keep this system. And he talked about a little bit of it. And if I asked you, I think you guys could figure out the three things. One is raise the age of when people start collecting, which they're already doing. And it also, for those of you who don't know, you can wait a little longer and get a little bit more. You can always get the report from Social Security Administration to find out how much you paid in and how much you would be able to make if you retired at, say, 66, or if you waited till 70. So raising the age limit of when, that's one way. It keeps you working longer and waiting to take out money. The other thing is lowering the benefits, and that's going to happen as well. He said that by the time millennials retire, you'll be getting 77% of what you were estimated you were supposed to get. I know, it's unfair, but we'll talk about our options. And then the third one is raising the amount of money that they actually take out. They've already done that many times. I think it's at 12% or 12 point something percent. So that's the other option, is that they can raise the amount. And usually, if I'm in a face-to-face class, I'll have someone say, what about doing away with the whole system? That's a possibility too. Congress could do that. That would mean that every single person in the United States would be responsible for saving their own money for their retirement. And as it is now, a little bit is taken out of your check every single payday for your whole life, and then you have some money coming back. So they would be putting the responsibility on you to make sure that every single paycheck you put a little bit of money away. But like he said, just a warning to all of you, this is only supplemental. This is not a full retirement replacement. So I know when we're young, we don't think about these things, but if you haven't already started saving every month, please do so, because who knows what's going to happen to the Social Security system. But there you have it. Not the greatest news. All right, so these just gives you the information on health and disability, Medicare. You can look that up in your book. This is our chart about the percentage at the current time of our GDP that goes towards these three largest programs. And the fourth largest is obviously to the Department of Defense, but comes from our entitlement programs. Okay, so now I'd like you to remember what two types of policies. Fiscal, and we talked about social policy, but now we're talking about fiscal policy, and then we'll talk a little bit about monetary policy. So first of all, fiscal policy is what happens in Congress. And they're basically putting together a budget. And they do this every time a new Congress is in session. It usually takes them the entire 2 years to pass a budget, and then hopefully it lasts for the next 2 years. And just like you would make your own personal budget, they do it by figuring out how much money is coming in and how much are we going to spend. And so it's a projection. They don't always stick to it, but most of the time Congress does. They stick to at least the budget and the overspending. So they have to calculate how much taxes they estimate coming in, and then they decide. So if you were to be asked what is fiscal policy means taxing and spending policies. So it's basically the definition of politics, figuring out who gets what, where, when, and how, and where we're getting the money from. Most presidents want to have a balanced federal budget. They did that for a very long time, until after the Great Depression and World War II, we saw a spike in government spending with the New Deal policies. And now fiscal policies continue to serve as the means of securing general welfare to the public. So everybody wants to have whatever service they've depended on or they want from the government, it comes out of the budget. And parties will differ on how they look to fiscal policy. Democrats they favor expanding spending, and Republicans prefer tax cut. That's not always true. The Republicans just passed a tax cut bill that had tax cuts in it, but had increased spending, including a near $1 trillion deficit. Okay, so tax bill explained. This isn't a tax class. I don't expect you all to understand difficult policies like tax policy, but I think a 3-minute video just to kind of get an idea of how our taxes, money coming in and where it's going and how this new tax bill is. I've added a couple more videos you can watch, but we'll just do this one together.
In 2016, Republicans have been obsessed with getting this one thing done. Tax reform. Tax reform. Tax reform. Tax reform.
We're going to have a phenomenal tax reform.
They've passed a bill, the president has signed it, so let's break down what's actually going to change. Imagine that instead of getting paid in dollars, you got paid in cereal. The government takes a certain amount of cereal in taxes, and it uses it to pay other people to do things, like build roads, fly fighter jets, do research. You get the picture. The more you earn, the bigger the share of your cereal the government takes. Sometimes the government wants to incentivize you to do certain things with your cereal, like if you buy a house for 100 pieces of cereal and then sell it for 200 pieces of cereal, you'd normally have to pay capital gains taxes on that profit. But there's a special loophole that says you don't have to. The tax code is full of loopholes like this, which means if everyone puts their cereal together, there'd be 2 bowls. One that the government dips into for taxes, and one it doesn't. Now, Republicans want the government to take a smaller portion, and they say they want people to keep more of the cereal. But if they do that, the government won't have enough cereal to pay for what it needs. So part of this new law is taking some of the cereal that's not taxed and change the rules so that it is taxable. That way, the government can take a smaller share of the cereal, but still pay for the stuff it needs. This is what politicians mean when they talk about broadening the tax base. Here's the problem. Republicans aren't broadening the base enough. They're taking a lot less cereal from people and adding some new taxable cereal, but not enough to pay for what the government needs. To pay for that stuff, the government is going to have to go into debt. This means they're going to have to take even more cereal years in the future to pay back the debt they're taking out now. Republicans think this will help grow the total amount of cereal available to both taxpayers and the government. So what happens to that $1.5 trillion gap? It goes back into people's bowls, but not everyone gets the same share. If you break the population into 5 equally sized groups based on how much they earned in 2017, and look at how much each group will earn in 2018, every group does get a tax cut, but fast forward 10 years, and you can see that lower and middle class Americans will actually pay more since their tax cuts aren't permanent. And if you break that top group into smaller groups, you can see the very wealthiest benefit most of all. So while this new law does close some loopholes to bring in new tax revenue, the bill's larger purpose is to realize the Republican vision of a fairer tax code, one in which the wealthiest pay a lot less.
Okay. So please look at these there's different topics on the tax bill. But just suffice to say that fiscal policy is figuring out how to tax us and where to spend the money. So right now we have when we talk about tax cuts, you have to be careful of who's getting the tax cuts and for how long. This current tax bill that is in place now, like the video said, is giving everyone initial tax cuts. There's some more details you can watch in the other videos, but some of them expire in 5 years after the next president will be elected, but not the high-end earners. Theirs never expires. Okay, so the second type of policy besides fiscal policy that has to do with money is monetary policy, and these are actions of the central banks. That's called the federal bank. They can manipulate the national money supply, they can manipulate interest rates, and they can carry out different shifts in the banking system. So the United States Central Bank is called the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed. Their headquarters are in Washington, D.C., and they have 12 bank branches around the country. So, like I just said, they can buy Treasury securities. They can set required dollar reserves for the banks. So right now, I think banks have to ensure that any person has up to $100,000 that they ensure they'll give back in case there's some kind of that they cannot spend of your money. Because that's what banks do, is they spend our money while it's sitting in there and invest it and make money off of our money. So yeah, so if they, and then they can also influence the interest rates. So if they reduce interest rates, so if all of a sudden they say, hey, we've reduced the national interest rate to 1%. So now you can go buy a house and you can get a loan for 1% as opposed to, I think it's now 4%. That would save you a lot of money, and that would stimulate economic growth. When they raise the rates, it usually gets people thinking, and they don't buy as much. And then, so what happens is when the economy is really good, then companies start raising their prices, and that's called inflation. And then the Fed could raise the interest rates so people stop buying houses, and then all the not just houses, cars, things, and then all the businesses, their business slows down, so they have to start reducing the prices to a normal level that people can afford. So they kind of can manipulate the market by raising and lowering the interest rates. They don't do them that extreme. They usually do it like 0.25% at a time. So the federal budget and the federal budget deficit. So I want you to know the meaning of the deficit, and I'm sorry I don't have a chalkboard to write this on, but the deficit, listen carefully, is the difference between the amount of money in a 2-year budget period that the government spends and the amount of money that they collect. So say they collect I'll just throw out a number, $1 trillion, but they spend $2 trillion. Then for that 2-year period, there's $1 trillion deficit. That's pretty much where we're kind of at now. This link is really good too if you want to take a peek. This link gives you an idea of the federal budget breakdown. It talks about revenue, which is income, how much comes from payroll taxes, how much from corporate taxes. It talks about spending, which is how much we spend. And we spend in different categories: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and military spending. And then they talk about the deficit, and I think it's not on your screen, but it's like $1.1 trillion. So, and this is with a Republican majority in Congress 2 years, the 2 years ago, or the first 2 years of the president, and a Republican president. So it's not true to say that only both parties do this. So this is a problem. We not only feel like we have too many taxes, but we also want more programs, but we also don't want a deficit, and we don't want to increase our debt each year that we're ending up having to pay more taxes. This shows the deficit. So that's the difference between how much each Congress decides to spend as opposed to how much they bring in. If they spent less than they brought in, there would be no deficit for that year. So just so everybody understands that. This chart, I'm trying to find a newer one. It's a couple years old now, but it just kind of says that if you took the whole budget and you divided it by how many people there are in the United States, then their total money would go to these different organizations. So the biggest amount goes to Social Security, then the military, then Medicare, and then I think food stamps, and then slowly it just kind of gives you an idea of what percentage of the total budget each program has. I still would like to find a better chart. There is a chart in your book you can look at, but it doesn't give you all the programs in the United States. It would be nice to know exactly how much is going towards each program. Okay. So the federal budget deficit gap between revenues received by the national government and the spending. So please know this definition of what a deficit is. So the president, at the beginning of each Congress, will propose a budget. All presidents have done this. The White House submits their proposal in early February in the new Congress, so that would have been this year. And the Office of Management and Budget will look at it, and but it's just a formality. It doesn't have any authority because Congress is in charge via the Constitution to pass a budget. So congressional budget experts, they work on their own budget. The blueprint of their budget of what they're going to spend and collect is called a budget resolution. They are not binding. They have to pass it, and then the president has to sign it. So this is when you heard last year of whether there was going to be money for a wall in the budget or not. That was a budget policy that they were fighting about. It has to go into committee, and then it has to be heard on both the House and the Senate floor. They have to vote on it. These are all the different appropriations committees. Appropriations is any of the committees dealing with money. And then we have a little bit of an idea here. This is how much money, I can't remember which year this is for. But this is how much money is brought in. This is from individual taxes, from Social Security payments, and from corporate taxes. And then this is how much goes out: defense, non-defense, other, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. This is the process of the budget making. So by this last October, a couple months ago or a month ago, they should have already come up with a budget. And so when they don't come up with a budget, Congress, so it says, by September 1st, the fiscal year starts on October 1st. Most of the time they miss the date. The dates are missed more than they're hit. The last time they passed it on time was in 1995. Usually they'll just pass an omnibus bill. These are all the outstanding appropriation measures in one bill. But what they do pass, and this is in bold, you need to know this, is a continuing resolution. And a continuing resolution is a congressionally approved act when no national budget has been passed before the start of a new fiscal year, and it extends the spending at the current levels. So if they don't pass this, then they cannot spend any money. And so if they cannot spend any money, what happens? We know what happens because it happened last year around this time. The government shuts down. So usually Congress is to their benefit to pass this continuing resolution. But if they can't get enough votes, and last year the majority was Republican, if they couldn't get enough votes to pass a continuing resolution, then and they couldn't get enough votes to pass a budget, then the government shut down, and they were fighting over the wall, and which was a part of the budget. So this link here shows you what kind of how many times. I think this is from 2018, but it just shows you they passed a continuing resolution. Let me scoot this over a little bit so you can see the dates. In March, back in February, in January, December. So these are continuing resolutions, and they're just basically Congress saying that the self-imposed deadline that they've had, they can't meet it. So we'll just continue last year's budget at the current spending levels until we can decide on a new budget. And usually they give themselves like another month or another 2 or 3 months, something like that, because they can't get too far behind. They've got to do it within their congressional 2-year period. All right, so off topic just a little bit, we're going to move to Nevada State. If we look at Nevada, there was some reading you were supposed to read in the Nevada thing about Nevada taxes, but I'll just kind of sum it up here. Nevadans have imposed and blocked taxes through initiatives and repealed them through referendums because we have this direct democracy. So we constantly fight not being taxed, but we have other sources of taxing. We tax gaming, we tax using a hotel, we tax marijuana, blah, blah, blah. Your list here. We are outlawed by the Constitution not to tax food, prescription, inheritance, and income. There's a couple other things, and this you'll probably be asked a question on the exam for this. But there's a couple other things that I think on the last election now we have made it so that they don't tax feminine hygiene products and medical equipment like canes and wheelchairs and stuff like that, oxygen tanks. But these are the main ones here. All right. And then in Nevada, we know that whenever they go to make policy, they have a constitutional mandate that they appropriate money to K through 12 school before they do anything else. So education must be funded, and it must be funded first. However, compared to other states, Nevada spending is inordinately low. So I looked up recently because I thought it would be a good idea to discuss this. How low is it? And there was a study done in Nevada. It said to adequately fund education, Nevada should be spending $9,238 per student. That's the recommendation of this new study that was commissioned by the legislature. Right now, the state uses a base of $5,387 per student when doling out their funding, which is 58% of the recommended amount. They would need another $1.7 billion to increase this amount. And then I just wanted to say on a side note that we had almost $1 million to taxpayers to build the Raiders Stadium. Sorry to all you football fans, but this kind of irks me a little bit here that that's close to half of what we need for education that we just spent on a Raider Stadium. I'm sure everybody has differing opinions on that topic, but there you have it. Okay. So in essence, making good policy, the goal or the reforms would be to have the most efficient system of delivering our government services by doing cost-benefit analysis or some kind of similar tool. Maybe use a free enterprise system to maximize efficiency. So the goal is to make good public policy. And then finally, I'd like to leave you with the phone numbers of your representatives. And you have a voice in what kind of policy should be made, should be amended, what your Congress people should be acting on. So here are their phone numbers and links to their offices. So in closing, just to remember for your exam, you want to study the 5 stages of policymaking. You should know the 3 largest programs, the entitlement programs, that's Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. You should understand top-down, bottom-up delivery of services. You should understand the New Deal policy expansion after the Great Depression. You should know the difference between monetary and fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is taxing and spending, and that's decided by Congress. And monetary policy is, and you don't have to know all the details of this, you just should generally understand that. And monetary policy is the manipulation of the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Fed, and their bureaucracy, and they can adjust the rates or maybe print more money, or they can tell banks how much they have to insure and stuff like that. You should know what deficit means. You should know the continuing resolution. The definition is on the previous slide. And then what things are not taxed in Nevada. All right? Okay. Good job. Until next time.